A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
Hey everybody, we're back with Elena Petrovskaya. This is our second part 2 of our episode with her on predatory monetization. If you haven't heard part 1, it's fantastic. And this time we're going to get into a lot more of, questions about what do we do about these things? What is predatory? What are the consequences of these things? And we'll get back to some of the stuff we talked last time too. Elena Petrovskaya, welcome back to the show. Yeah. Woo!
Thank you.
So, Elena, I'm going to start with this. We talked about a whole bunch of, honestly, way more than I knew about, ways that monetization can be, at least, what we didn't talk about was predatory monetization. We talked about things that players complained in your survey, right, that were predatory monetization. So, how are these supposed by players to amount to, or by you to amount to predatory monetization, right? So, now we're focused kind of on the predatory. How is it different than other forms of monetization? Because we talked before in the show on how monetization might be deceptive or manipulative and how it might harm players in games. But what is the predatory aspect? What's that all about? And how can monetization be predatory? I mean, is there a little animal that's being hunted down here? Like, what's going on?
Well, so this is actually quite a difficult topic to discuss because even in this domain of monetization in games, there are different definitions of predatory being used. So we have the, I don't know if you're familiar with the King and Del Fabro definition, where they discuss predatory to mean broadly entrapment and kind of referring to the sunk cost fallacy, where people might have invested in a game and then they end up basically being drawn in and spending more than they might want to because of the elements that are at play there. But I think for me, when I talk about predatory, I do think exactly about what you just said, where there's sort of like a power imbalance between the game and the game designers and the player, and the player is almost being, used for the benefit of the company, and in some ways that's exploitative, and in some ways it's manipulative and coercive, and there is all this pressure from the game and the designers that play there. But simultaneously, it's almost like a little bit of a working definition, right? Because I have had a lot of conversations with people about the use of the word, because some people think that it's not the best word to use because it implies intent on the part of the designer.
Right.
And with a lot of these things, even if you as the player or me as the external researcher consider it to be predatory, and you're saying, yes, this has been designed in to get the player to spend money, we can't conclusively say that that's the result of the designer's intent. It could come from any number of other reasons. And malicious design isn't necessarily the same as, in some case, I don't want to say ignorance, but yeah, if something was designed in without that malicious intent there, it might not necessarily be predatory.
Sure. I think it's also important to remember that it's rare, I think, when a designer of anything, sees the bad in their design, right? In the sense that, we all are biased towards thinking that what we do is good. And, I was actually, I was playing Clash Royale yesterday, and I was thinking about our earlier conversation. And, I think it was like the idea of loot boxes and surprise mechanics. And I started seeing it from two perspectives, I was like, on the one hand, I'm used to these loot boxes, right, that I'm getting. I'm used to the fact that I have to wait. I'm used to the fact that sometimes I'm willing to pay money not to wait. And I could see it from the one hand as, hey, look, this is kind of fun. There is something to say about the whole, like, what is in the loot box? Will I get what I want? It's also frustrating, right? But I could totally see it as if I took one perspective, it seemed to me like, oh, they were totally just manipulating me to frustrate me by making me wait before I could open my thing, so I have to pay for something, and and we talked some about this last time, right? The two different currencies, all that kind of stuff they have. On the other hand, I saw it as just completely neutral. Like, you know what this game's about. You've been playing this game for a couple of months, right? I mean, do you really have bad feelings about this? Not usually, right? And then every once in a while, I thought about this. Well, look at this. I downloaded this game for free, right? How great is that? I've been enjoying it for a couple of months. I've paid like $5. Wow, that's a lot of bang for the buck, right? How awesome that they made the game this way, right?
Yeah. Yeah. There is sort of a balance there, right? I don't think every designer who makes free to play games, and even perhaps the ones that have loot boxes and are necessarily designing those game environments because they want to maximize how much they squeeze out the players. I think in some cases it genuinely is because the designer wants the game to be accessible to everyone, and is just sort of implementing these standard forms of in-game transactions. But I think it's when they cross a bit of a line and it becomes so clearly designed to get people to spend money that people start noticing and actually start feeling affected by it, then it might be too far. And though that's when we start seeing things that could be labeled predatory.
Is it about how much the audience or the designers think about who their prey is? Like are they designing towards making money off of certain people?
You mean like vulnerable populations, or you're looking for weak prey in particular? When I think about predatory, and I think about predatory loans from the 2007-2008 housing crisis, they were literally picking out like the weak, uninformed, people who didn't really understand much about finance, people who essentially were desperate for house loans. So in a sense, some of those predatory loans seem to be intentional in the sense of finding, someone that, they knew would not be, I don't know, educated enough to make a smart investment there. I don't know, Andy, if I'm getting this exactly right. And, but that's the way it seemed. And this was a while ago at this point, right? But that's the way it kind of seemed to me. And it seemed a lot more than simply like a power imbalance.
We talk about, and the industry talks about whales, and that's definitely a hunting sort of metaphor. We're out hunting whales. So, if we're predatories, then there has to be prey. And we've already identified these prey as whales. And whales are just anybody who is willing to spend a lot of money on our games. And we can sort of figure out who they are by saying, who spends money to begin with. We know that if you spend money once, you're likely to spend money again.
Right, but it's interesting, all these things, all these metaphorical terms, right? I mean, now we're hunting whales instead of we're enticing whales, by giving them something they want to come and hang around, our beach. I don't know, hang around our boat as we're whale watching, while the people on the boat get to enjoy themselves watching the whales, and everybody wins, right?
Right. But that's not the way it goes. I mean, it's definitely a hunting metaphor. So we have to sort of like own up to that as an industry, that we're like, this is a hunting metaphor.
Right. But the question, but I'm assuming, Elena, that this is not, the industry doesn't call these predatory. I'm assuming these are critics of the industry.
Yeah, I haven't heard that term used from the industry personally. I don't know if it's ever used by people who prefer alternative models personally, but I know that there are some types of microtransactions, specifically loot boxes, maybe others, but I can't think of the specifics, that are frowned on by some developers, specifically indie developers, who sort of consider that those kinds of practices aren't something that they would use. So I don't know what sort of the inter-industry discourse is on that. But yeah, I mostly heard it used in academic context. Again,
I think just to wrap it up, because I think we want to move on, but it is just really interesting, the kind of how we call these, right? It's like, we can use deceptive, we can use manipulative, right? It's interesting because manipulative, you can be unconsciously manipulative, right? Which is kind of interesting, but I don't know if you could be unconsciously predatory. You know, again, right? These kind of terms. Okay, and Andy's like, I don't know. Is there a difference? Okay, so what does this have to do with player well-being? Right? In what sense can predatory monetization practices be harmful to players?
Right. So it's early days in terms of this research. I've done a little bit on it, but there's still a lot we don't know. But the main study that I did that sort of looked at players who play the kinds of games that have these techniques in them and linked it to well-being was qualitative. So I really tried to sort of build up an understanding of how this interaction with these possibly predatory design mechanisms might affect player well-being. And we considered specifically this subdomain of games designed to drive spending, which I'll briefly remind you consists of the pay or grind mechanic, where you can pay or spend a long time playing, pay or wait. Then the nerve cycle, which is where you buy something and then it gets reduced in power in the next update. The game building dependency or microtransactions, unfair matchups, the free game experience being underpowered, and then lastly, more rarely, payment needed to avoid negative consequences. And so I did a follow-up study from this taxonomy which categorized some games as such. And for this study looking at well-being, we looked at specifically these games that had fallen into this category as meeting this criteria. And we interviewed people who'd been playing these games and who considered themselves to have been affected in some way by their engagement with these games. And what we found was that people do really get drawn in by these mechanics. And I'm still trying to figure out if it's specific types of people or people who are going through specific things in their life at that point. But actually you get really drawn into a game, and that can affect your financial well-being because you spend more than you might have wanted to at that point or can afford. It can actually affect your sleep because you end up playing a lot to meet goals, or you have to wake up at certain points in the night to keep playing after the timer resets and things like that. That then affects your social well-being because you're spending a lot of time playing games and talking and thinking about them and playing with other people rather than being present in a social setting or conversation. Affects your emotional well-being because you feel guilt when you spend less money, and you feel guilt when you realize that you've been playing this game for 6 hours. And sort of relatedly, it affects your productivity in your job or in your studies, because again, you're either playing the game or you're thinking about it, or you're just tired from not sleeping at night because you've been playing the game. So and people talked about all this stuff in really quite distressed terms. They really felt like they'd been taken advantage of, and it had really affected their life at that point in time. So I think there are some, I've only done this one piece of work so far. I'm working on another currently, so the more quantitative one with a larger sample. But there are, at least with this sample of people, there were some clear indicators that those games could affect their well-being.
I think anyone that's been playing games for a long time has probably experienced a bunch of those things.
For sure.
I've
Tell,
right.
One of the things that we do design for as game designers is we do design towards getting people into that flow state, that state where they do lose track of time, and they do, because our brains really like being in that flow state. We regardless of what we're doing, we enjoy. Our brains are, are kind of built for this. And so as game designers, we do try to get people into this flow state. Of course, we would never want to hurt anybody with it, but getting them into this flow state seems always like a good idea, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's not a good idea to try to get people into this flow state. Maybe we should be building more things to break people out of the flow state once in a while.
These are the sorts of things where you're making a product, the way Andy's talking about, you're making a product that's just too good, in the sense of it makes you want to keep going and going and going when you've got other life things going. And the idea is that, you're going to be responsible enough to keep yourself from harm. But we've got concerns here that the kind of flow that you've got going on is particularly disruptive or particularly difficult to get out of, which is interesting. If you guys think Do you guys? Is this just flow? Is this all this is? You're just creating a situation where the person just wants to keep on going. It's easy to think of with the sleep thing, or is there more to that here? And Elena, I say you're definitely thinking there's more here.
No, I think, well, again, I don't want to make any drastic assumptions because it's quite initial research, but the things that I was seeing in this way that people were talking about these things, it definitely, to me, paralleled more dysregulated gaming patterns rather than flow necessarily, because people weren't talking about the experience in a positive way. They had almost like a compulsive relationship with either keeping playing the game or coming back to it. And I think there's also ways to make games engaging in a way which creates flow that I think we've all probably experienced, that don't rely on those kinds of mechanisms that either mean you have to play a silly amount to achieve an objective, or you have to keep coming back to the game to see if you can keep playing. I think a good game will just build that into the game progression naturally. I think that there's something else going on here which sort of taps into this idea of excessive gaming rather than just a nice flow state.
I think the other thing here is that a lot of these things interrupt your flow state. You can't enjoy the game. You have to stop and pay money so that you can enjoy the game.
Yeah, but this is where. So I think there's something. I think there's something really important about like what Elena you're saying about like there's this flow state that you can get into, but then there's also this sort of compulsive state. A flow state won't bring me back to the game, but a compulsive drive will bring me back to the game. Every few like, oh, let me go check my messages. Let me go check my game. Let's see what's going on in my game. That's absolutely not flow state. That's something else. That's some other psychological thing. And I'm not a psychologist and I can't really talk to it. But so I think there's something really important there between those two things. You were saying about how like paying money brings me out of the flow state, but we're designing it such that it won't. That's the sort of scary design aspects that I think we should be paying close attention to, is that we should be, when we're asking people to pay money, we should be breaking their flow state. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to do it seamlessly. We're trying to make it, as an industry, we're trying to make, all these payments just like a one-click thing. And that definitely does not break us out of the flow state. That just keeps it going.
Right, but there's still, so if you're putting me, let's say I'm looking at the list that Elena has here, right? If you're putting me in unfair matchups that make me feel then, okay, I gotta stop and go buy some stuff so that I could power up. I feel like that's disrupting my flow, right? I'm getting frustrated that the matchups I'm in are not really working. You don't think that's how it works? The flow still happening?
No, not at all. Not at all. They put you in this sort of challenge state, and then they give you a button to press to overcome the challenge. You're right in the flow state, and and it stays right there.
I guess what you're saying is to maintain flow, you gotta give people an easy, quick way to pay. Otherwise, you cannot maintain the flow.
You present them with a challenge that they can overcome, and they know how to overcome it, and it's easy to overcome, and then they do it.
That challenge is paying money? Okay. To me, it's a strange way to talk about these things.
I just wanted to say, I don't think it's always just flow as well. I think in some cases you develop an attachment to the game, and that goes beyond flow on sort of a longer term level. And that's where you're willing to keep coming back and to keep overcoming these challenges in the game. Like some of the people that I talked to knew that the game was maybe trying to extract money out of them, but they developed attachment to the game for a variety of reasons. And in some cases, it's actually quite a complicated relationship. They also felt like the game was doing something for them. It was, it was in a way benefiting their mental health, playing with their friends or things like that. But simultaneously, that's why they were willing to keep playing and to keep spending money on it. But simultaneously, it was actually bad for them. And they had this really weird, like, complicated, semi-toxic relationship with these games.
Yeah, my mom has this relationship with this jigsaw puzzle game that I think we mentioned before. It's constantly throwing ads at her. She hasn't paid any money into this game, but it's constantly throwing ads at her in really, really, really like obnoxious times. And But she won't quit because she's finished all these puzzles, and then she would lose all this progress that she's made in this game. And, she's been playing it for a long time. And I'm like, there are other jigsaw puzzle games out there that are probably better. But she's like, no, I've got to stay with this one because this is where all my stuff is.
That's it. Yeah.
So one of the things I want to mention here, right, is that these kinds of monetization schemes, whether we call them predatory or not, right, even, there's questions here about what sort of harms we're talking about. And Elena gave us a bunch of different harms. But even if there's no harm here, right, the monetization scheme could still be wrong, right? So it's kind of like, I'm trying to manipulate you, Elena, and it doesn't work, right? You're smarter than I thought you'd be. But the fact that I tried to manipulate you can still be wrong, right? Even if no harm was actually done to you. Obviously, and we're going to talk in a moment about which ones you guys think are particularly wrong or not really wrong at all. But sometimes we talk about these microtransactions as being wrong. Sometimes we talk about them being harmful. But what about them just being like annoying or inconvenient or frustrating? How did you tell the difference, or how do you tell the difference whether you're doing your research? In fact, when you're doing your research, did you actually ask them something like that? Do you think this has harmed you? Do you think this is wrong? Do you think this is just annoying?
So not in the first instance. When we developed the taxonomy, we thought about we literally just asked those questions, just unfair, misleading, aggressive, and went from there. But then we spent some time when we were writing the paper reflecting on what might be the distinction between something that players might just dislike or might come across to them as being one of those things based on their own backgrounds and ways that they're used to seeing games. So things like one of the categories is literally just the general presence of microtransactions, which might be considered fine by a lot of people, but for some people it isn't. And the sort of kind of checklist that we came up with in terms of how you can differentiate between something that could actually be harmful and the ones that could just be annoying or inconvenient. So we have the first being that they're tangible, so you can actually see the specific design element in the game. You can identify it as a feature that you can like comment and show someone. The second being that this actually has some kind of consequence for the player. The third being that it's not optional, the transaction. There is no way to continue playing the game to the same level or have the same experience without engaging in the microtransaction. The fourth being that the transaction does not offer value for money. So you might spend money on something and you get something that's just not worth that, or you ended up spending for no reason. And the fifth being that they create inequality. And they don't necessarily have to meet all of these, but something that meets at least one of these criteria is a bit of an alarm bell.
Mm-hmm. Though it's interesting, right? I mean, if it meets one of those criteria, so let's say it's a loot box where I just got the loot box and I got nothing that I want from that loot box, right? So I really got nothing of value in return. Have I been, so this is a case where I might be harmed or wrong, but it's not just inconvenient or frustrating that I got nothing, but I'm literally being wronged in this way. Even though, or that's the idea, even though I could have potentially in the loot box gotten amazing things that are super valuable. I mean, does it need to, what if like say, we are talking about things like loot boxes and it evens out in the end, whatever that means exactly.
I guess with loot boxes is, I think, right, let me slightly edit the wording of that. I think the fact that they don't always offer value for money is in itself concerning because, loot boxes, there's not even like a set amount of time in a lot of these games where you might get something that is worth your money. So I think, and loot boxes come with a whole host of other problems with their similarity to gambling. And to be fair, when I was considering these categories, then I didn't specifically apply them to loot boxes. But I think, yeah, like I said, because there is sort of variable value for money, even if it might even out, like in that specific instance, the player might feel like they've been wronged. So I think it would still count.
Okay. If a design is frustrating to me, so this is when we go back to your idea about intention, and was intentionally frustrating to me, right? Would you say that it's wrong?
If it had been designed to be frustrating, and frustration in the sense here that it's not frustration as part of the game, which I think in some cases you can have frustration as part of the gameplay experience.
Right.
There's a game, I can't remember what it was called, and I'm going to completely misremember what it is as well, but I'm pretty sure it's just like a guy trying to get a ball up a hill or something, which is really frustrating, obviously, but that's literally just a gameplay experience, and that's, in that case, fine.
This is literally a Sisyphus game?
I think so. It's someone trying to get something up a hill.
Right.
I really wish I could remember what it was called, but it's, yeah, and that's okay because that's literally like the intended experience that the designer wanted to create, and then becomes fun in a way. But then if the intent is to create frustration, which then leads to an outcome of you spending, that is then harmful.
But again, it is interesting. I want to point out that you can have frustration. You could have frustration that is harmful, right? That's actually harming you, right? Right. You could be frustrated in a bad way that's causing you harm, right?
Wait, what? How is that? But I don't want to suggest that frustration by itself can be harmful.
I don't know. I'm going to say frustration by itself as a psychological mechanism. If you are frustrating the players and you're not giving them any way out of that frustration, and you're not doing it for the purpose of having them explore that frustration, you're just causing them anxiety. I mean, that seems pretty harmful. Doesn't it psychologically harmful, even if no money is involved here?
It doesn't seem like fun to me, but that would just make me put the game down. I mean, I always have a way out of that.
Right, but that doesn't mean you're not harming them, right? I mean, you might say the person is not as responsible for what they're doing because the game player can always put down the game, right? But they're putting down the game because they're like, I'm being harmed. You know, what's the point of me just playing this game that makes me feel bad or anxious or stressed? Or
yeah, I think we'd need a psychologist to tell us whether that's actually harmful or not.
Philosophers are not enough? What? All right.
No.
All right. You know, given this big list, are there any practices that you and maybe Elena, we'll start with you, that maybe you think maybe this is annoying, but it's not really misleading or unfair or predatory?
I'm a little bit hesitant to say because I think it's not really for me to say ultimately, because this is based on like player perspectives of playing all these different games. But I think some of these are a little bit more perception focused than others. So let me just get back to the figure for a second. So things like teasers that could be implemented in quite different ways. And some people might have more of a threshold for what is okay in terms of being teased by a game. And then also things with like monetization, basic quality of life, people might vary in what they consider to be core aspects of the game, and what to some people just becomes a DLC and is fine and something they would pay money for, to other people is something they feel like they should have as part of the original game experience. I think I wouldn't say intuitively that any of these are just fine. I think they probably vary quite a lot based on your background and what you might expect from a game, the expectations you're going to play these games with.
Yeah, and you know, just to kind of reinforce this a little bit, right? This is a list of complaints, right? Some of these complaints are, you know, many of these complaints are valid, right? But that doesn't mean that every complaint is valid. You know, Elena, I have, I think I have some of these. The free game experience being underpowered. You know, I'm like, it's a free game experience. Yeah, you know, I mean, you're going to have to pay for a game. But I mean, that seems fair, you know, pay for a game. Microtransactions is a business model, right? To me, that seems like they're really, you know, every business model is going to have an ups and downs. You know, I think there's plenty of ups with the microtransaction model, though. I mean, as our conversation is saying, there's downs, and we got to pay attention to those. To me, those are kind of really the big ones.
I think overpricing is one of those things. It's hard to judge because you know, these are virtual goods. So like, what is the value of it? If the value is arguably zero in all cases, right? If I'm willing to pay it, is it overpriced? Yeah, I don't know that there can be overpricing if somebody's actually willing to pay it. I think that individuals can be overpriced compared to other individuals, and I think that would be unfair. I get a benefit that Shlomo doesn't for whatever reason. I get, things cost me less because I spend more money or whatever that is. So, but we actually see that in other worlds as well.
We had an episode on this, Elena, dynamic pricing. And
Yep.
this is one that's actually not in your chart. As far as I see, right? I think partly because I don't think gamers know about that.
Right.
Yeah, that's the thing. There's all kinds of things going on under the hood as well, which they might literally not know about. It's actually kind of scary to the extent to which the companies can use the player data to then send them to personalize the game around them to then increase all these mechanisms.
Okay. By the way, I do want to say something about the overpricing one. If you attach it to something, and again, I'm thinking of Battlefront 2, right? And the whole, if what we're talking about is you bought the game, but there are characters that you really, really want, and we will let you buy them for an exorbitant amount, right? That to me can be, but I don't know if it's the, and of course I said an exorbitant amount, which means, right, you're overpricing. But that to me seems like a special situation where the bigger wrong is another one that we talked about here, where you feel like you didn't get part of the game. And, they're charging you. Even if they charge you for the rest of the game, that would be okay. But they can't charge you too much, right?
Yeah. I guess overpricing then ties into some of these other mechanisms where people are already indignant about spending money on something, and then they're like, but this is also a ridiculous amount of money that I'm having to spend.
Right. So we're thinking sort of two different wrongs. Though with the rest of the stuff, I agree with you guys. I don't think there's a whole lot of things wrong with the teasers. Yeah, though, let's switch it up now. Talk about which ones do you guys think are particularly let's pick two each here. Right? And Lena, let's start with you. Which one do you think are the ones that you're really really concerned about?
Well, I think for me, just the pay or grind or pay or wait mechanics, because those are the ones that could really, I think, do some damage in terms of those are the ones that I've heard people refer to in terms of having real tangible effects on their well-being and the way they go about their day. And I think there's almost no need for wait timers. There are other ways you can monetize a game. With pay or grind, I can maybe understand it a bit. You have two ways of achieving a challenge, but even that can be done in a manageable way. So if it's abused, I think these two can generally be really harmful. But then aside from that, I think anything that is just outright lying and saying that you're going to get something that you don't get as a transaction is just out of order. But that's a little bit almost easier to regulate and is literally illegal, whereas the other two are not so much, but it can be built into a lot of games in a way that's potentially quite harmful.
Though I want to push back against the illegal part. A lot of times it can be, but again, I think the Star Wars example with Battlefront 2 is one of those where, right, because you can deceive essentially by lying. You can deceive by withholding information. And you can also deceive by making the other person think one thing while you're intending something different, where you can essentially have a weaseler where you could say, oh, yeah, I can see how they would have thought that, but this is what we meant. And it's a reasonable misinterpretation. When really you intended it. You intended that misinterpretation all along. And I don't know if they did that third one, right? Where, but the players felt deceived, right? But maybe they say it wasn't really deceptive. But notice, I mean, that's a kind of legal issue rather than, but you could still say it's fucked up. They deceived the players. I want to ask really quick about the pay or wait. So it's not the pay part, it's the wait part that you're really concerned with, right?
Yeah, I guess both. I think if someone, it comes back to the idea of flow, if someone is really invested into a game and it cuts them off at a very, a point where they would ideally not like to stop playing. They might just be caught up in it, and they might be like, yeah, I'll spend this money, I'll get more lives, and then the game sort of grabs onto you, and you end up doing it more and more and more, because you don't always want to wait 24 hours. But in some cases, the waiting is dangerous too, because some people might be invested in more sort of a longer term task. Like some games have, for example, challenges where you have a certain period of time in a team, you have to complete a task, and these people almost like commit to this collective goal with their team, and that might involve them having to wait a couple of hours for something to happen in the game, and then to maximize their time after this happens. So they end up setting alarms in the middle of the night and things like that, and then there's no good outcome. Like you're either doing that and being disruptive, or you're spending money. And I don't know, I think maybe in the early days of this being implemented it was harmless, but I think now a lot of games do know that it's a good way to get people to really sort of follow what the design wants them to do. And I think in some cases it can be really bad.
It's interesting. Andy, what do you think? So notice now we're just talking about the weight, even without the money. What do you think about the weight mechanisms?
I mean, it's annoying to me. And so I don't play the games that have it because it annoys me. But I don't know that it's particularly dangerous in that sense or damaging. It can be like, all right, so the two that I would choose as the worst, the riskiest to me are the dark interface design patterns for sure. And this could be, so depending on how the weight is implemented, it could be as a dark design pattern, right? Where I can where I'm forced to wait, but the thing that something tells me, oh, click here if you want to speed this up, and then I don't realize that I'm paying money. Something where it's actually being like obscured or occluded, right? And so those sort of dark interface design you can build those sort of wait times into that. So there's that dark interface design can be kind of an umbrella for a lot of different things, right? A lot of different potential ways of really harming the player. And then, but of course there's all these other ways too, like, not hiding the X to close a button so that you have to press OK, and you don't necessarily know what OK does for you, and it turns out OK either spends some resource that you then have to replenish. That's all of that harms you and leads you towards potentially having to buy more currency because you've wasted it because you couldn't find the X. That sort of thing. I mean, those sort of things we should just not allow at all. And then the other one I think is payment needed to avoid negative consequences. So something bad is about to happen, but you can stop this with 99 cents.
That was also one of mine, Andy. That was gonna choose. To me, that just seems really, really, really wrong. Especially though it is interesting. The example that Andy gave us last week, right, was really interesting because it was a narrative example. Right, so you attach emotion to characters that you care about, and you get to keep them alive if you pay money. Otherwise, they're dead. As opposed to something bad happening to your character, where again, like your character is going to suddenly go down a couple of levels unless you pay up. That just seems really, really, really wrong. In both cases, I really don't like that. The other one
it feels like hostage taking, right? I've taken some element of the game that you like, and I'm holding it hostage. You would never think that that's ethically all right to do.
I was going to say the reason I didn't specify either of those two that we just talked about with the negative consequences and the dark pants was because I, from my further studies, get the impression that they're a little bit more rare than the two I mentioned.
I've never had it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think with the two that I talked about, with the grinding and the waiting, they're actually pretty common. Like a lot of the really top grossing games will have them, and to me, I think that makes them worse because a lot more people will interact with them, and people might be less aware that those elements are even integrated into the game until they're quite far invested in. Whereas with things like paying to avoid negative consequences, maybe less people will do that because people can just they have this outright reaction that, why is this happening? This is really bad. Like, I'm not paying for this. This it's just ridiculous.
So Lena, what you're saying is, because one way to think about it is the worst thing that you do, the more people will be aware of it, the less effective it will be as a bad thing to be done. And when doing monetization strategies, right? The idea is that you want it to work, but you don't want the player to be upset, right? Because otherwise, because then it's not going to work too well, right? And you're saying that pay or grind or pay and wait are particularly problematic because people allow them to work. So they actually, at the end of the day, cause more damage. That's interesting.
I wouldn't say people allow. I just think that they're just actually just good. They're not good design techniques in the sense that they're good or beneficial, but they're good as in they can be really well designed and really effective. And that makes them more dangerous.
Yep.
The two that I had in mind, that I guess the other ones, is game builds dependency on microtransactions. To me, anything where you're building dependency, right? So again, you are, especially if you put intent here, you're trying to create an addictive relationship to the game involving money. That to me seems to be really, really, really wrong. And the other one to me, there's two more, I guess, the unrealistic presentation of product, right? Anything where you are being deceptive in what it is that you're getting here. That seems to me really wrong for the obvious thing that deception is wrong. And the multiple currencies being used to cause confusion. Because when we talk about how deception is illegal in marketing, right? Confusion is not. And it's really interesting, right? As a try to, don't deceive, just confuse. It's sneaky, and I really don't like it because it's trying to kind of get around being straightforwardly wrong, right? While still, I think, having the same kind of intention, right? Mm-hmm. There's no good reason to have these multiple currencies except to confuse people. And if you're making money by confusing people, that's obviously not the kind of ethical relationship you should have with your customers.
Yeah, I agree entirely.
One of the things that happened in the United States shortly after the burst of the housing bubble in 2008 was legislation for the purpose of regulating predatory lending practices, right? And of course, there are all kinds of regulations that limit things like deceptive or potentially harmful marketing practices, though I've never heard of any of them being used in video games. Are there, at least in the United States, are there any regulations about any of these practices that you list? And are there any new regulations being proposed for these sort of predatory monetization practices in video games?
So I can mostly speak for the UK and a little bit for Europe. I don't, just in case I accidentally missed something out. As far as I'm aware, definitely not in the UK. The extent of regulations has been, so I talked a little bit last episode about homescapes and gardenscapes having their ads removed because they were so unrealistic, but that was to do with advertising standards. So from that side of regulations rather than anything games related. There is also the Consumer Protection Agency, which is now not so much regulating, but there's recently been a discussion report that sort of synthesized evidence about how they refer to it as choice architecture in games might push consumers to make certain decisions and make certain transactions that they might not otherwise have carried out. So they are starting to pay attention to it, and I'm hopeful there'll be some regulation coming in the next few years. And of course, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but in the UK recently, there's been the government has basically said that in terms of loot boxes, that there should be self-regulation from the industry. So from that angle, I don't know, maybe we'd be seeing something similar in terms of other practices, that they would just entirely put the onus on the industry. Although that could also go the other way, where in terms of the, if they see that there are many, many, many more practices, they might be inclined to say, oh, clearly the industry isn't going to self-regulate this. But I think at this point in the UK, at least, the conversation is beginning and the governing bodies are starting to pay attention to it and work with academics, but there's not any coherent regulation in place.
And I think the same in the US, if not less, right? I mean, it's interesting. I'm curious what you think as someone who has worked on these things. We've had Leon Shao here to talk about loot boxes and regulations. And that's a very, very specific thing because of the gambling aspects. So, you don't need to know that much about video games to really kind of understand the idea of loot boxes. But it strikes me that as I was listening to you, I was thinking of everybody in Parliament and how many of them understand, 3 of the 35 practices that they've laid out. And it's weird because, we all see advertising. Advertising seems like a pretty kind of easy thing to understand. And even when it comes to things like finance, because finance is so important, right? People in government will take the time to understand it because it's so important to their constituents. But video games, all right, how many people in Parliament know a lot about video games enough to really try to pass laws that do this?
And this may be just a generational thing too, right? As we get into that age bracket of people who end up in Parliament or end up in the U.S. Congress, we now know about this stuff, and we will know about this stuff in the same way that everybody knows about advertising now, but maybe didn't 40, 50 years ago.
Maybe, and this is and this is the issue, right? Because there were things that I didn't know about until my son started playing his games, right? And so in the U.S., Josh Haley, Hawley, I never know what is it. He's a senator from awful guy, senator from Mississippi or Missouri. I'm thinking Mississippi. He actually wanted to ban loot boxes in the U.S. And any game with addictive elements, like and he was talking about his kids, right? And he's like a guy, I think now he's in his mid-40s, but he's still the minority in government age-wise. Right, so at least by mid-40s, you've had kids, you've gone through that whole experience. If you have kids, you can't help but deal, but it's different than your grandkids. That's why I think of situations like China, where so much of it is kind of, what does President Xi, who's a grandfather, think about how things should go, and how much does he know about video games? Right? It seems really hard to get things regulated when people in government don't really have much understanding of the nature of the beast.
I was just going to say, I'm like, at least in the UK, I'm definitely seeing that the government is starting to take video games more seriously and is like really prioritizing video games research as one of the, at least in the sort of culture, media, sport aspect, that video games are a very prevalent thing that affects a lot of people. So I'm hoping that that's heralding a change for, more research, more funding, more regulations in this space.
As a researcher, and I realize that you're a researcher that doesn't take sides, right? You're not arguing, you're just figuring out what people think. But I'm curious, is there anything that if you could pass regulation on any of this, would you? And if so, what would you do?
Well, that's a very big question, and I've actually been cautioned against saying that I would regulate certain things because the sort of level of research that we're dealing with is still, quite nascent compared to a lot of research into other technologies and things like gambling. But I think for me, the first step would be, rather than to explicitly ban things or restrict things, is just to have more people paying attention to the space, because at least some of the big game stores are just a mess in terms of age ratings, and the age ratings just completely don't match the game content and things like that. And I think also just maybe there needs to be more quality control when a game makes it onto the market, especially a game that isn't completely free, that might have microtransactions in them. Independent people need to check that game and say, well, you know what, this element could be harmful. We should flag this, talk to the developers, figure out what, get them to either change it or to just not let the game reach the market. But, I recognize that would take a lot of time and money and specifically setting up probably a specific organization to do this, which would be difficult. But I think simultaneously blanket banning all games that have certain techniques in them would be difficult and not necessarily the way forward.
I think there's a good argument for using the laws that we have now and just applying them to video games in ways that are probably our legal system and our governments haven't considered yet. Things like advertising and deceptive advertising techniques and things like that can be probably brought into games, and look at the way that games treat things like, in-app purchases and go, all right, is there anything deceptive going on here?
Yeah, it's interesting because, I think in our system in the U.S., a lot of things get driven by lawsuits, but microtransactions typically are just so small that, it's, if you sell me a car, I might sue you if it's defective. If you sell me a game, I'm not going to sue you because it's so, the amount is so small, right? And it's interesting. I think, Andy, I'm with you on this. I think there's probably plenty of, if we just applied consumer protection laws that apply to other products to games, I think it would probably solve. And I don't really have regulation ideas specifically myself. I think studying them is a very good idea, like Elena says. But but applying existing laws, I think, could really help to not make them an exception.
Sorry, can I just add? I think that's a good start for sure, because when I was doing my this paper that's sort of based around this consumer protection regulations, we found some of these elements in these games that like literally went against the consumer protection laws. So even if someone was just to do like an audit and implement these laws in these games that are currently, not abiding by them, that would in itself be a start. And to even say that someone cares about these things would presumably serve as a bit of caution for people who are just designing games, because just sort of no one is paying attention to this at the moment.
Right.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. All right, Elena, let's wrap this up. What do you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I wanted to sort of highlight the point that all games are essentially built for profit. And, while that's not the only or the final goal of a lot of games, and most games are built with the game experience and the player experience in mind, it is the case for some situations that games are essentially built for profit. And unfortunately, some people can fall foul of these design elements, which are used to drive profits, and can be affected negatively. And just having an awareness of the fact that this could be happening can protect your well-being and can help you continue to maintain this relationship with games that is positive and is beneficial for the player. So I think for our listeners, if they wanted to learn more about these design elements, how they might affect them, and how they might be tapping into player psychology, and also ways around which there might be improvements in this space, they should listen to this episode.
All right. Elena Petrovskaya, thank you so much for coming on our show. Yeah.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
All right, guys. Good podcast, GP. Play nice, everybody.
You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.